Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a media platform which aims to examine the path taken by Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean which has experienced a vivid past and possesses the potential for a bright and vibrant future. Sri Lankan trade, and in particular exports, have played a critical role in this country's past. To speak to us about Sri Lankan exports being out of sync with global and local developments and what needs to change to revive this sector, we have invited Subhashini Abeysinghe, a specialist in the area of international trade. She's an economist by training, having received her first degree and her master's at the University of Colombo and a master's in law and economics from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Subhashini is currently Director of Research at Verite. Thank you so much for joining us, Subhashini.
Thank you very much for inviting.
If we start off of talking about exports going back to independence, how have we fared from then to now? Have we done better? Have we done worse? Where do we stand right now?
So when compared to 1950s, actually today's Sri Lankan economy remains less integrated with the global economy than it was in the 1950s. If you look at just two indicators that shows how integrated an economy is to with the world market, one is to look at the world market share of that country. In Sri Lanka's case, Sri Lanka's world market share is very small. It's like 0.06%, but it has declined over the years. And another indicator that shows how integrated an economy is to look at the exports to GDP ratio. That is, how much does export account for when you look at the total output of the country. And actually, in 1959, Sri Lanka had exports to GDP ratio of Sri Lanka was 28%. But today, it's half that amount, just 14%. And that shows over the years, unfortunately, Sri Lankan economy has become less integrated with the world market. Ironically, at a time, the rest of Asia has become far more integrated with the world market and has become such an important player in the world market today.
If we look at the region, if you look at South Asia, or we look at the rest of Asia and going to Southeast Asia, how well are we faring in terms of being competitive as an exporting country?
Yes, I always say if we want to feel good about ourselves, the way is to compare with those who do worse than us. But if we really want to do better, what we should do is we should compare ourselves with those who have done better than us and learn from it. That is why when it comes to exports, I would always encourage Sri Lanka to compare or benchmark itself not with South Asia but with East Asia. Because South Asia in general has not fared that well in exports. There aren't that many lessons we can learn from the rest of South Asian countries. But in contrast, East Asia has done very well, and exports or international trade has been a major factor that drove economic growth of these countries. So take for example countries like the first wave of the East Asian countries that actually went from being low income countries to high income countries like South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then the next wave from Philippines to Malaysia to Indonesia and Thailand, and the recent countries that are showing very high levels of growth both in exports and in economy like Vietnam. They are the countries that one should compare with if you want to learn why did we fail in exports in comparison to them. So one good example I always like to take is how in 2011, Sri Lanka for the first time in exports crossed the $10 billion mark. And an optimistic government set itself a target to be a $20 billion export economy by 2020. Where are we now? So in 2011, Sri Lankan exports was 10.5 billion. And in 2019, we have gone from 10.5 to 11.9. So we are nowhere close to the 20 billion target. What is sad is actually at Verite Research, we wrote an article in 2014 saying our Sri Lanka export target was actually trying to be mediocre. That in comparison to others, our target is very modest. But we concluded saying even with this modest target, we may not be able to achieve it. Why did we say this target was modest? Because we were at that time thinking of doubling our exports in 10 years. And when we looked at the region, we saw our neighbors have doubled their exports with much less time than 10 years. For example, Bangladesh went from 12 billion to 24 billion in just 5 years. And Vietnam went from 50 billion to 100 billion in just 4 years. So you look at your every country in the East Asian region, you realize have doubled their exports with much less time. But unfortunately for Sri Lanka, we set a modest target in 2011 to double our exports in 10 years, but we are nowhere closer to it. And the prospects of us doubling exports without changing the strategies that we are adopting is very, very low.
That point that you raised, it can be done. It is being done. Countries like Bangladesh are doing it. If you have seen their change in 5 years, they've obviously done something right. And that's probably what we need to try to understand. So when we come back on the Sri Lankan Understanding, we're going to talk about what went wrong. We're going to talk about diversification and where we're going with Sri Lankan exports. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're talking to Subhashini Abeysinghe about Sri Lankan exports, sometimes being out of sync with global and local demands, and ways and means through which we can revive this sector and what needs to change in this particular sector. Subhashini, if we talk about things that went wrong, can we pinpoint particular mistakes, policies that shouldn't have been implemented, or policies that weren't implemented, or policies that we never dreamt of in the first place? Are these some of the factors that contributed to us falling behind or not being able to achieve those targets that we thought we could achieve or we had the capacity to achieve? What went wrong?
So when Sri Lanka designs its export strategy and tries to identify what is the main problem in our exports, normally we come up frequently. You may hear this problem discussed saying, hey, one of the biggest problems is lack of diversification, that our exports are concentrated in just few products, not just products, and our exports are concentrated in just few markets. So I disagree. I would like to say actually diversification is not the problem, it is actually a symptom. But the problem is that our export basket is out of sync with global demand and global developments and also local developments. So instead of saying we are in a small basket, I would rather say maybe we are not in the right basket of goods. We must really think what went wrong. So I often like to take two examples of what were the most important or the biggest changes that happened in the world market that rest of Asia embraced and used it to grow faster compared to Sri Lanka that lagged behind. One of the biggest changes that happened in the 21st century in the world market is actually emergence of China. China as a major, massive market for goods in the world. China's share of world market was just about 3% in 2000, but it increased to 11% by 2018. That was an increase of fourfold increase in its share. And not only that, China accounted in terms of volume, China imported only something like $200 billion worth of goods in 2000. But by 2018, China was importing over $2,000 billion worth of goods. That is an increase of 10 times. And there is this massive market that is emerging in our neighborhood. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka has, to this date, failed to make use of this massive change. And we have been taking a lot of loans from China, but we are hardly exporting Sri Lankan products, made products to China. If you look at Sri Lanka's exports to China, even in 2019, Sri Lanka exported only 2% of its total exports to China. What about our neighbors? Vietnam exported something like 17%, and Thailand around 14%. South Korea is exporting over 20% to China, and China has become one of their major markets. But unfortunately for Sri Lanka, we have been somehow not sufficiently integrated with the global market, and we were not able to respond effectively to this change compared to our neighbors. The second factor that showed that the biggest change that happened in the world market is what you call the emergence of global value chains or production networks. In the good old days, this actually happened towards the end of the 20th century and continued to the 21st century. In the good old days, we produce, if you take cars, automobiles, computers, all of these things, we had this idea we produce everything in one country, in one factory. But today, we talk about factory North America, factory Asia, factory Europe, because now no longer are these products manufactured in a single factory, in a single country. They're manufactured, different components are manufactured and assembled in multiple factories and for a single product. So this slicing of production network is another, with the technology, with transport improvement, reduction in trade barriers, this was made possible. And this was a massive change. As a result, actually today, 2/3 of global trade takes place in intermediate products. These are parts and components, they're not final products. And our East Asian neighbors were very fast to respond to this change, and they became very important parts of these production networks. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka has never been able to join any of these production networks. A good example is to look at the trade in electrical, electronic products, machinery and automobiles, because these are the ones that really became part of these global value chains. And let's take a look at the share of Sri Lanka's exports. In these sectors, Sri Lanka exports only about 5% of its total exports are in these sectors. What about the East Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia? Over 40% of their exports are in these sectors. So this is one of the reasons why they managed to do far better than Sri Lanka. That is why I always say that the problem with Sri Lanka's exports is we are out of sync with global market developments.
A very sad situation, and when you listen to that, talk about the basket of goods that we have. And I remember once it was mentioned that we have the same basket of goods that we had 30 years ago. We're still selling tea leaves. Other countries are buying the tea leaves and they're adding value to it, and they are selling tea oil and tea essence, which is for a much higher price, and they are reaping the benefits, whereas we grew the tea. And this is where we have not, as you use that word, not gotten in sync. So maybe our basket of goods needs to change radically, not just slightly. It has to be a radical change as to what we are going to send out there. But in terms of diversification, what else can we look at? There was a time where we went from coffee to tea. There was a time where we realized, and now we are realizing, we should go from tea into tea oil or essence. But what are the other aspects that you feel for diversification to be globally competitive? We've obviously got to achieve very high standards, and as you said, not compare ourselves with those doing worse than us, but those doing better than us. Where are we falling back there? Why aren't we diversifying? Is it that the private sector is waiting for the state sector to lead? Is it the state sector waiting for the private sector to be innovative? What is the mismatch here? Why is it not falling into sync?
Yes, so one of the main, when you said we are concentrated in few products, what do we export? So actually in 1970s, we made one transition in terms of our composition. That was a major shift. What did we do? By the 70s, actually from independence to the early 70s, Sri Lankan exports, over 70% was concentrated in agriculture. And only about 20 or less than 20% was concentrated in industrial products or manufactured products. So after the 77, we actually made a transition. Today we have a export basket where 70% of our exports are in manufacturing and only around 20% is in agriculture. However, that industrial export basket is heavily concentrated in just one product, garments. So Sri Lanka's exports, over 40% is garments and another 10 to 12% is in tea. So this is where our problem is. We are saying apparel and tea account for nearly 60% of Sri Lanka's exports, and when we decided to double our exports, obviously one strategy was to diversify. But actually if you compare to 2011 to today, our export basket still remains the same. It has not changed at all. And I agree with you, it not just last decade, it has not changed for the last 3 decades. So the question is why? And not only that, that's a greater problem. It's not just that we have not diversified, but actually Sri Lanka is no longer competitive in the sectors they're concentrated in. Apparel and tea are highly low cost, low skilled labor intensive sectors, and we are a country that has emerged from being a low income to a middle income country, and we are no longer a low skilled, low cost labor surplus economy, which makes these sectors no longer as competitive as they used to be 3 decades ago.
Thank you. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the future of exports. How are we going to go into the 21st century? We're at the beginning of the 3rd decade of this century. What is in store for the export sector? When we come back with the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We are in conversation with Subhashini Abeysinghe from Verite Research, and we are talking about Sri Lankan exports being out of sync with global and local developments, and what ways and means can be adopted in order to revive this sector. What needs to change in it? Subhashini, so far we've talked about the problems, we talked about the symptoms. It's been rather negative in terms of what it has been like. We've not caught up with our neighbors are surging ahead, neighbors in the immediate neighborhood and also not too far away. What is the solution? How are we going to change this? Isn't it time that we now addressed those root problems, address problems that have developed from then to now, and surge into the future? We need to strategize. This is 2021. 2 decades of this century are over. What can be done?
Yes, actually there is a lot of things that can be done. What is most important is for Sri Lanka to understand, if we want to develop exports, we need to remain very globally oriented. We need to really understand what are the big changes that is happening in the world and how can we effectively respond. And to be able to effectively respond, we should have systems and processes that are flexible and agile, that can change within short time and that are not very rigid. So I'll give you a very good example of how did other countries achieve this, right? One of the most important things that we forget when we talk about reviving exports is that can only be done through investments. So if you want to transition from one sector to the other, you need people to come in, Sri Lankans as well as foreigners, to come in and invest in other sectors. So that is the only way you can develop new products and penetrate new markets. So one of the things that we should really seriously look at is not just trade policy, but the importance of investment policy when changing our trade structures. So getting our investment framework right, reducing the time and cost that investors have to undergo to actually take off an investment in Sri Lanka, reducing red tape. These are very, very important, because what we need to remember is countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia actually revived their sectors by encouraging as much investments as possible into export-oriented sectors by people in their own countries as well as people from investors from rest of the world. Then the second most important thing for Sri Lanka to figure out is, why did we fail to get into production networks and production global value chains, is really getting our borders right. So basically the time and cost of getting a product into the country and out of the country is a critical determinant of your ability to succeed abroad. So cleaning our border agencies, automating them, making them efficient is critical for you to be able to respond effectively to the changes in the world market.
This is where we've got to look at this whole internationalization of what we're doing. Understand what others are doing. I mean, we're not going to copy them, we're going to replicate it. We've got to have a homegrown indigenous solution of how we are going to address it, but at the same time meet those international challenges. One final point, Subhashini, before we end. 2020, 2021, and of course it looks like it might be the next year as well, COVID seems to be one of the biggest challenges across the board for every sector, exports included. For you, is it an obstacle, a challenge, or is it an opportunity? How do you see it?
COVID-19 actually can be an opportunity. It all depends on how we convert a challenge into an opportunity. So COVID-19 has made certain changes in our lifestyles, the way we consume goods, the way we consume services. It has made an enormous transition, especially through using digital technology. So today, e-commerce, these are trends that were there in the past, but it has been accelerated, that actually we must go online to do everything, buy online, sell online, work online. So take our health checks online. It's just become digitization and automation, acceleration of both these have become one of the biggest transitions that happened with COVID-19. And even though there is vaccination, even if we succeed vaccinating people and successfully deal with the health crisis, some of these changes that occurred during COVID-19, in my view, is unlikely to be reversed, especially the digitization and automation. So it's really important, if Sri Lanka is thinking of reviving its exports, to understand this shift in production, working and consumption patterns of people and see how it affects the global demand for goods and services. If we fail to respond effectively to this next wave of change, of automation and digitization, the acceleration of that, it is going to be another missed opportunity, like many missed opportunities Sri Lanka has encountered in the past. So it's very important going forward that we really keep our eyes open and really study the global developments and see opportunities and know in what should we invest, especially in what skills we should develop, because when you're going to a world where digital technology becomes central to everything we do, that also depends a lot on our education investments, our skill development investments, because our Sri Lankans should have the right skill set and right infrastructure to be able to embrace this change and convert it to an opportunity.
Very, very valid point for us to wrap up today, where whatever we've had in the past, whatever we've had to face, we've got to realize that today things are changing. There was a time where we divided countries and called them rich countries and poor countries, and we fell into the second category for a long time. But no one asked the question, rich in what and poor in what? Very often countries that are very rich in natural resources are very poor when it came to industrialization. And that was the barometer on which we measured countries. But going into the 21st century, we're realizing digitization and automation is exactly what you said, across the board, not only in exports, across the board. This is the future. We either adapt, survive and swim, or we're going to sink. And we're going to look at this 50 years from now, look at this issue and say, what went wrong? Why didn't we do it? Why shouldn't we do it? What were the missed opportunities? And there'll be so many. And this is a continuing challenge that we have. So on that particular note, as we bring this particular episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding to an end, we begin to understand one of the overarching problems that we face with regard to our exports in particular, and of course a lot of other areas that we look at under the trade umbrella, is the need for diversification and looking at where we're going, what we have to offer. We've got to have a lot more to offer than we have already. Are we ready to do that? Are we doing it? Are we on that path? Are we strategizing? These are issues that we take up here on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much, Subhashini, for taking time to be with us on the show today. Join us again next time for another episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding, where we look at the past, understand the present, and strategize for the future.